Supply Chain Protecting the Nation. Ron is a fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, where he currently leads the FSMA implementation project, which includes the development of key security standards and guidelines for the federal government, contractors, and the United States critical infrastructure. Ron holds a master's and PhD degrees in computer science from the U.S. Post-Naval School. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ron Ross.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I see a lot of the folks are up listening to the big data. That's where all the action is apparently today. So I wanted to take a little bit of a different approach today. I've been out to GTRA many, many times and talked a lot about cybersecurity and all the things that we work on at NIST. But I wanted to take a little bit of a different approach today. Talk about the supply chain and some of the things that are going to really be affecting us long term. There's lots of important issues. I think the thing that really drives me every day when I get up, people ask, why do you do all this cybersecurity stuff? You know, it's not because of FSMA, although that's what we talk a lot about, or OMB guidelines, but really, for me, the passion for cybersecurity and now privacy comes from the Constitution. And I know a lot of us don't look at this document every day. I carry a copy with me everywhere I go because it's a very powerful document. It really talks to our way of life in this country. And cybersecurity and privacy those are the seeds of these two very important ideas were planted way, way back in the Constitution 200 years ago, before our founding fathers didn't have laptops and tablets and all that good stuff we use today, but they came up with this very, very important document. A little bit. Oh, okay, great. So the preamble, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and here's the key part, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. A very powerful set of words. Provide for the common defense had a certain meaning back 200 years ago. We have the notion even today of defending the country in the kinetic space, the military working in the various places around the world where they have to operate to help us maintain our freedom here in the United States. But provide for the common defense in the world of cyber is very, very different. And I think this is the important thought I would like every one of you to think about today. And it kind of follows along the lines of the last hour's discussion, talking about mobile devices and everything. We're being pulled very powerfully in the direction of this new technology with the mobile devices and all the great things that we have to use to make us more productive. But we also have to remember that in using new technology, there are great rewards and there are also great benefit, or great rewards, and then there's a downside to that same use of the technology. And so I want to just talk a little bit about the federal strategy, because this impacts everything. You heard the last panel talking about BYOD, and you have the Congress on one hand, and you have the Coast Guard and the military, and all of the branches, the federal government, all the different federal agencies, and our private sector. We all are facing the same issues today. And it all comes down to really the heart of what makes this conference what it is, information technology. Every one of us today, whether you're on the warfighter side, whether you're in Congress, or whether you're in the private sector, General Motors, Bank of America, every one of our organizations has to have IT, information technology, to have their mission be successful or their business case. Pure and simple. And that technology being the core of mission success, it must be dependable. And in order for it to be dependable, it must be protected. And that gets to much more than configuration settings or doing patching or some of the things we do routinely. We call those good hygiene, good housekeeping. This problem is much deeper than that. It goes to the heart of how these individual products have been developed and manufactured over time with our great industry. So the federal strategy is build it right and then continuously monitor. So this is where the presentation is a little bit more fun. They have right brain, left brain. This is for the right brain crowd right now. We really have to have an honest discussion. And I think if you look at the discussion the last hour and the whole theme of the conference, you're going to see a very consistent theme. We are going down the road of deploying this technology, whether it's mobile, the tablets, the smartphones, whatever it might be. We're going down that road. The question is, are we going to do the right thing and protect the technology that we have built and deployed across this vast infrastructure? That's the bottom line. We're kind of at a fork in the road right now, and the direction we take in the next 5 years will really set the tone for the direction of the country for many, many decades to come. We're going to talk, we always talk about the threat space and this exfiltration problem. It's massive exfiltration right now going on. Whether it's the Chinese or the Russians or whoever the adversary might be crawling all over our network, stealing intellectual property from our great companies, secrets from the warfighter community possibly, the defense industrial base, that cannot go on forever. Because at certain points, the question I always ask myself is, could we have built our stealth technology? We have the stealth bomber, the stealth fighter, all of that stealth technology. Could we have built that technology today with today's use of the devices that we have and all the leakage of critical information? You see, these are questions, and it's not just about stealth technology for the warfighters. How about that small startup company in Silicon Valley that's working on some kind of a new software design? And that's being stolen by competition somewhere worldwide. These issues absolutely affect economic and national security. They've kind of come together in one area now. We still try to divide those up. You know, we have our national security stuff, and that's all cranking over here. And then we have all the other stuff on the other side. In reality, we are all together under the same tent. And what's brought us together is that great umbrella called information technology. One of the things I've noticed is there's been a kind of a dumbing down of what cybersecurity is today. When I first started 30 years ago, good cybersecurity was all about having good functionality, encryption, access control, identification, authentication, two-factor, whatever it might be. And there was something called assurance. We cared about how software and hardware developers built those functions into those products. That was important. It's not important for your kids when they're carrying around their iPhones, but if you're working in a Neil's organization and you're working with the nuclear power industry, and those ICSs, those industrial control systems, have to be as secure as they can be, it does make a big difference for those folks. Or if you're a warfighter and you're importing these chips that have been tampered with from our supply chain, and the integrity of the weapons system data that puts rounds on targets being compromised for our warfighters, that's a bad thing. And that's the future that is going to be in every one of our lives if we don't take proactive measures soon to change some things and make this situation a little bit more cohesive across the board. So Einstein has a great quote. It's on the bottom of my email. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. We can't dumb down the cyber problem. It's not going to go away. You can talk about BYOD, you can talk about all these different things. The basic fundamentals of information security, they were here 40 years ago, they're going to be here today, and they'll be here 40 years from now. There's also a notion being touted today. You've heard a lot about the notion of these limited control sets, whether it's the Australian top 35, or whether it's the SANS top 20, or pick your favorite control set. And the claim is they can stop 80 to 85% of the cyber attacks by doing that limited set of controls. So I said, great, let's do those, but let's don't stop there, because to me, if I tell you can stop 85% of the attacks, like saying you can plug up 85% of the holes in the bottom of your boat. You're still going down, it's just going to take a little longer. And so we've got to actually, this is part of that discussion about when you talk about critical controls and you look and you tell a person 10 to 20% of the cyber attacks are still going to get through even after you do your so-called critical controls, and you don't find in that set of controls something called contingency planning or continuity of operations, where you develop a plan to figure out what are you going to do when that 20% actually happens to you, then that's not a good thing. And so I just try to caution you, you've got to think broad in all these, and don't get sucked in by something that looks like a simplistic solution but doesn't really do what you need to do long term. Well, you hear a lot about these things. We're going to talk about good hygiene, which we all have to do. Good cyber hygiene, where you count everything, all your software and hardware inventory, you inventory everything on your network, you know what's on your network, that's a good thing. Making sure all of your components are configured. We heard about the gold disk earlier. We were in one of our working groups where you have all those configuration settings and you establish those and lock down your components. That's a good thing. And certainly you want to patch as fast as you can, but I'll guarantee you with the complexity of what we're building today, this Patch Tuesday stuff is going to go on forever. How many folks, if you haven't had a chance to download the recent Defense Science Board report, it came out about a month ago, and it talks about the military of the future and what we're up against with regard to these high-end adversaries. They have 3 classes of vulnerabilities, actually 6 levels, but 3 classes. The first one was known vulnerabilities. That's the stuff that you hear about every Tuesday when you go out and you get the Microsoft or the Oracle patches. Then there's the next level up are called unknown vulnerabilities. That's what we hear about called zero-day attacks, zero-day exploits. That's when the adversary, your attacker, knows something about you that you don't know about yet, and they're going to exploit that before you have a chance to fix it. That's an unknown vulnerability. And then there's the third level of vulnerabilities called, this is where the adversary actually manufactures a vulnerability within your infrastructure, which they're later going to come back and exploit. So you've got 2/3 of that vulnerability space that you know nothing about right now. And the only way to make that better is to strengthen the infrastructure. It's not going to be about counting your boxes or configuring your boxes or patching. That will not work for those top 2 levels of vulnerabilities. The only thing that's going to work there is fundamentally strengthening the IT infrastructure. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means later on. It's actually more important in the supply chain world knowing what's in those boxes that you deploy. We talked about whitelisting a little bit earlier. Whitelisting is where you limit the executables on your machine to a certain set, a known set that you think is more secure, or limiting the websites that you allow your folks to go to surf. So knowing what's in those boxes, though, is very critical because you know what? You can whitelist malware into your enterprise. If you pick a program that you're whitelisting and that program has already been infected with malware, then you're permanently saying this stuff is good, and you got that malware now institutionalized in your organization. Making sure you have enough boxes. That the analogy there is, someone talked earlier about the confidentiality, integrity, availability. Well, availability and integrity are becoming really driving a lot of organizations today. So making sure you have enough IT available that can support your mission space is critical. And you have to now assume that some of that IT is going to be compromised along the way. We know that. We have empirical data now that shows the level of penetration within our federal networks and our private sector. So the question is, what do we do about all that? Making sure that your supply chain has enough refresh capability so when you do lose certain capabilities or you're transitioning to next generation IT, you've got that supply line coming in so you'll always have enough capability to help the mission execute properly and be successful. Well, these are issues that go well beyond just the patching and the configuration. So let me see if anybody out here is old enough to remember what these 3 terms, what that was a metaphor for. Anybody out there? Tamper-proof, always invoked, and small or simple enough to understand. I know that some of you out there, I see a couple of graybeards, but not many. Well, what this was the old reference monitor. Now, for those of you who don't remember, a reference monitor about 2 or 3 decades ago was a part of your operating system. They call it the kernel. Very small amount of code that was highly trusted. And the reason that was so important is because the operating system and that kernel being at the heart controls all the resources of the organization that are part of that IT infrastructure. So making sure that we have the ability to trust that small amount of code was very, very important. We've lost an entire generation of people who understand what assurance is now and why it's important. Because you can even hear this in this morning's conversation in the last panel about mobile applications. We're talking about an app store. Is anybody talking about the fact that these applications are maybe not trustworthy? Just because they're in the app store doesn't mean they're trustworthy, number one. But those apps don't run on Vapor. They run on an operating system, whether it's iOS or whether it's the Android OS. And there's hardware then underneath the operating system. And in between, you have a little bit of firmware. If it's like a workstation, it's got your basic input-output system, your BIOS. The adversary is going low in the stack. They're getting down to compromising firmware. And so when you talk about a trusted application, there is no such thing as a trusted app if it's running on an untrusted operating system or untrusted infrastructure. So we're kind of fooling ourselves in that regard. So if you apply those same concepts now to our world today, and you look at tamper-proof always invoked and simple enough to understand, tamper-proof would be analogous to knowing your supply chain. And we've got some controls in our brand new update to our control catalog, released about a month ago, that talk about supply chain. We're now giving we're empowering you to have the right requirements in your specifications when you go into the acquisition process, so you can understand what your supply chain is all about and how all of those suppliers are building trustworthiness into their supply chain as they build those products and move those from their location all the way to you. Always invoked. Know your software developers and the processes they use. We've also built some new controls into our 800-53 that allow you to interact with industry to make sure that they do have good design and development processes. Not that you're telling them how to build the software, but you want to make sure they have a good build process in place. It's mature. It allows that software to be developed so it's more trustworthy. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to eliminate as many of these latent vulnerabilities, software errors, that later become vulnerabilities. And the more we can eliminate those up front in the development process, the fewer that you have to chase every Tuesday when you're going out to those updates that come across every week. Small enough, simple enough to understand. This gets to the heart of the problem. Know your architects and your systems engineers. You know, we talked to one of our discussion tables this morning, or this afternoon, was about the integration of security into the core organizational processes. Most of you know today that your security teams sit in their offices down the hall, and I would venture to say they're very disconnected from the acquisition office, the systems engineers who might be working building systems on your behalf, or the folks who run the life cycle, whether it's an agile development process or whether it's the classic SDLC. Your security folks in most cases are sitting well outside that sphere. And of course, enterprise architecture. A lot of EA going on. We have the federal enterprise architecture, but not a lot of integration of security. So it's no surprise that we continue to talk about baking it in and building it in, and we have all of our CISOs in place, and we have all this FISMA stuff, and we have all the NIST standards and guidelines, and then we look around and we say, hey, how come we still have all these breaches? Well, we're missing some, it's right there, but we're missing the big picture. Unless and until we de-emphasize security for the sake of security and move that whole line into the normal business processes so it becomes part of the business solution. Until we do that, we're never going to get this problem under control. It's that simple. And I didn't understand this problem until about a year or two ago, because before that we were building all the controls and all the standards and everything was cranking along, and then we still see we're not getting the results we need in many cases. Now, we made a lot of improvements, make no mistake about that, but it's these three areas going forward in the future that are going to be the real game changer. Despite what all the things you hear about, you know, NIST is out now working with the private sector to build this thing called the cybersecurity framework. But there's no mystery in all of this stuff. We know what we have to do. It's not complicated in sense of it's fairly well structured. But better software assurance, better engineering, and better supply chain risk management really is at the heart of our future. So when you hear these great debates about the number of controls, don't be sucked into this argument. It's not the number of controls, it's having the right controls. One of the things we've done in our most recent update to Rev 4 is we have this concept called overlay, which means as our control catalog gets larger and larger, which it will, tied to the threat space, the overlay allows you to go in there and pick the controls that are relevant for your mission, your environment of operations, and your technology. Now, I think somebody mentioned in the last panel, the Federal CIO Council, OMB, last week released the mobile, it's really a mobile overlay. It's security guidance for mobile devices for the feds. And if you open up that document and you look in the back of the appendix, you're going to see a whole bunch of security controls from 800-53 Rev 4. But they're customized for mobile devices. So if you have a control that requires you to scan your device continuously, that doesn't work very well on a small form factor smartphone because you run the battery down pretty quickly. The military is building a tactical overlay. They don't have in their weapon systems the ability to audit constantly. They don't have the storage capacity on these weapon systems to keep all that data. So all those AU controls from our family of audit controls, they go away in that military tactical overlay. The Space Command is building an overlay. Well, they don't have a lot of guards, guns, and gates up in space, so the PE controls are tailored out of that overlay. The message here is when you want to build it in, you have to have the great broad parts bin of controls to choose from. And having the ability to thoughtfully go into that parts bin and pick out the right parts, bring them into your organization to support a specific mission or environment of operation, that's the future. And that's something that we don't do very well. And this is going to involve a dialogue with IGs and auditors in a big way because they've got to be read into this new strategy. Because if they're looking at this problem from a different angle, they're going to continue to beat up on our folks in their oversight responsibilities, and we're going to be working on different pages. And that's going to be to the detriment of both the audit community and also the folks who are the operators who are trying to get the job done. So here's the conventional wisdom. Patch early, patch often, patch endlessly. It's a losing strategy. And it's not easy to say that because the conventional wisdom is what are you always told? Patch quickly. But you can't ever keep up with the problem because we're building such an incredibly complex infrastructure that you can never keep up. In computer science, we have a term called thrashing. It's where the computer's working real hard, but nothing's getting done. Just think about your organizations and the pressure on all of your folks, just the missions that you have to do, and the shortage of people, and now your budgets are getting smaller. So all of this pressure and the continuing notion of patching early and often, that really is going to start to butt heads very quickly, and it's going to become counterproductive. So we talk about how do you fix that problem long term? Well, let's start with working with industry. Why do we still have cross-site scripting and SQL injections in web apps today? You know, that's a secure coding problem that we can take care of with. It's not rocket science. We have to be able to, and this is where our 800-53 Rev 4 is now empowering you as consumers to ask for the good secure coding techniques in your acquisitions, in your RFPs. As consumers, even though the federal government is a small sliver of the overall industry, we still have the ability to leverage the buying power that we have, and we need to make sure that our acquisitions are smart acquisitions. FedRAMP is an excellent example. We listed every control we wanted the cloud providers to do. The cloud providers go build those in, and then we have an independent lab come in with their folks and assess those controls to see if they were actually effective. That's a good model. Industry knows how to do this. They do a great job, but we just have to be able to communicate our needs. Trustworthy systems. That translates to being stronger, more penetration resistant. This is the whitelisting example I gave, and I kind of already talked about this a little bit, but whitelisting is like if you were to go out and tell someone you can only buy and drive blue cars. That's kind of a whitelisting thing. You're limiting their choice. to a certain color car, and that kind of narrows the field quite a bit. But when you do that, you don't know really anything about how that car was built. Just saying only drive blue cars doesn't tell you if they reinforced the doors with that hardened steel, or they have the airbags and all that good engineering that went into those cars, and they're not all the same. You know, cars are built now, and they use that as kind of a business case for, when they're going out in the marketing space to get you to buy the car. Safety is a big deal. Quality materials. All of these things, safety, engineering, quality materials, you can't get to that by just saying only drive a blue car. So this is like the whitelisting technique that works much better is a combination of limiting the executables or the websites that you let people go to, and having your developers build quality software, and making sure that that software has not been tampered with from the time it's built at Microsoft or at Oracle till the time it gets to your box. And that can be done through what we call digital signatures. It was mentioned last hour in the panel. You know, one of the things we're doing now with the compromise of the BIOS, the firmware, is that Dell, for example, now is putting up on their website, they have actually now, for all their different models, they're going and they're offering a signed copy of the BIOS. So you can download the BIOS, make sure it hasn't been tampered with, reinstall that, and now you know that's going to be a much more secure solution. And they're going through all their different product lines. And at NIST, for example, we are now going through and upgrading all of our BIOS to make sure that at least the adversary has not gotten down to that level. You see, you got to go and play in the space where the adversary plays. The message today is that good housekeeping is certainly important. I don't want to give you the impression that counting your boxes and patching and configuring stuff is not important. But I do want to make the point is that that is a necessary part but not sufficient for stopping some of the high-end adversaries. And I wish that we had the ability, and this is a government-wide thing, a leadership thing, we have not shared the kind of threat data with the private sector that we need to. If I were king for a day, I would have every company out there have the CEO name their most trusted employee, who they trust, and take that one employee and get them cleared to the top secret SCI level. Have them have access to as much of the classified threat data. That one individual goes back to the company and tells the CEO, I've seen what they can do. Here's what we need to do to protect our business. That may be the only way you can do it without clearing more people than need to be cleared. I mean, it's a tough problem. Our intelligence community and the DOD and the national security folks have a very tough problem. The more people you tell, once that becomes public, then the adversary knows that you know. And now that becomes a known vulnerability instead of an unknown vulnerability or a 0 day. So there's equities issues that have to be balanced all the time. Here's an idea for you. Maybe we don't really have a threat problem at all. You know, we run around talking about the sky is falling and, you know, the adversary's got great capabilities and we're getting hammered and we're going to all die, you know, and all that. Maybe this is not a threat problem. Maybe it's a complexity problem. And I use the NASCAR example because it really illustrates how one industry, the racing industry, handled a threat problem in their space. Now, in the NASCAR world, let me get back here, their threat is hitting a brick wall at 200 miles an hour when you're driving around Daytona. But that threat is built into their business model. They don't sit around wringing their hands about that threat like we do. What they do is they look at that threat and they say, okay, that's part of what we do. There's their vulnerability. It's these drivers that get in the cockpit of that car and are actually driving around Daytona or Talladega at 200 miles an hour. Here's the impact. You say, I'm using the risk assessment model. Threat, vulnerability, impact. And the likelihood is the fourth component that's going to happen is almost 100% in the NASCAR world. So what's the solution? They don't sit around wringing their hands about the threat. They invent what they call the Hans device. Now, about 10 years ago, Dale Earnhardt Sr. was killed at Daytona when his car hit the wall at 200 miles an hour and it broke his neck. They engineered the thing called the Hans device, head and neck safety. Every driver wears this device now. And no drivers are dying because of neck injuries anymore. You see, this is the build it right part strengthening the mechanism. You can't control what the adversary is doing. The Chinese and the Russians, whoever the adversary, whoever the attackers might be today or tomorrow, they're going to be doing this forever. Jesse James was robbing banks 100 years ago or 200 years ago, whenever it was, and we still have bank robberies today. The threat's not going away. What you can control what you can control. So we can't control what the bad guys do. We can control how we defend ourselves. I put these 3 companies up here. I was in San Francisco at RSA, and I spoke at the CISO Summit a couple of months ago. And right after I spoke, the CISOs from Netflix, Intel, and ADP spoke. And I was really struck by their message. It was a totally different way of looking at cybersecurity. In these companies, they don't do cybersecurity because of FISMA or OMB or any kind of regulations. They do it to bury the competition. And I'll use the one example of Bill Burns, at the CISO at Netflix. He says, we don't just deliver DVDs in the mail anymore. We actually are the largest television station in the world now. We produce miniseries, and we have a lot of intellectual property that we have to protect. And that intellectual property is streaming through the Amazon cloud to our customers. They have implemented some of the strongest cybersecurity protections that you would even expect to see anywhere in the government. Hardware encryption. They have a resilient cloud operation, so they take down a whole region of their operation at one time to see if the other regions can kind of reconfigure and stand up so no customer loses service. And the reason they do it is to bury their competition. And so in Bill Burns' world, he sits right next to the CEO. He's part of that integrated project team that we talked about earlier where, here's the mission, here's everyone that has a stake in the mission being successful, everybody gets their say. And that gets back to my point. The security office is outside, not on the inside today. And until we get to that point where we're doing things like Bill Burns and the folks at Intel and ADP are doing stuff, we're never going to be as successful as we need to be, especially for critical infrastructure. The things I worry about, critical infrastructure and our industry writ large, who, it's all tied together because if our industry is not cutting edge, and being an energetic part of our economy, then it translates to the warfighters at some point. You can't have a first-class military without great leadership, great training, and great technology. And that great technology comes from our great industry. And it's not just the Lockheed Martins or the big companies out there, the Northrop Grummans. This is the small mom-and-pop or startup companies that are producing that great new innovation that's going to work its way through the technology life cycle and end up in a warfighter system maybe 2 or 3 years from now. That's what it's all about. And in a free society like we have the best of the worlds of innovation, creativity, freedom, and that's going to breed these new technologies. It's going to fuel this innovation. And then you have the bad guys not working very hard to take it right out the back end. That's where we are today, unfortunately. All right, a little bit about the left brain. For those folks who are looking for the real NIST update here, I got a left brain portion of this presentation. For those of you who haven't been paying attention, we did release 800-53 Rev 4. This is our security and privacy control catalog on April the 30th. Just to give you an idea, the document had, in the first week, it had 1.5 million hits on our website in the first week. And it had over 500,000 downloads in the first 5 days. That's a lot. And that's not all government folks. A lot of these folks are in the private sector. These are the gap areas that we addressed with Rev 4. And you're going to see the ones that are highlighted in blue tie into the supply chain kind of theme of the presentation today. Application security, supply chain, assurance, and trustworthiness. I just wanted to give you a little sample of when I talked about working with industry and trying to get better component products. Because let's face it, most of the stuff you do today, you're going out to the commercial marketplace. You're buying operating systems, network devices, applications. All that stuff is being developed out of your control for the most part. The only leverage we have is through our acquisition process. And so we built and modified a set of controls in the catalog that allow you now to go out to industry and really hold their feet to the fire in a way that we've never done before, unless you're in the DoD and you're doing these high-end acquisitions. Most of our average consumers out there are not requiring developers to do secure coding, or else we wouldn't end up with so many cross-site scripting and SQL injection attacks that come in through these weak and poorly developed web applications. We can do better, and these controls are a sample of some of the things in the catalog in the SA family. That's the systems and acquisition family that deal with software and system assurance. You can see good engineering principles, good configuration management, good testing and evaluation, making sure they have good design and a good development process. And again, we're not telling industry what process they use because they know how to build software. They do that all the time. We just want to make sure that they're doing something that's a mature process they can actually talk to, reducing the number of errors in the code. Here's some more controls from the family that, again, talk about architecture, design, tamper resistance. That's critical stuff today, especially because we import all of our computer chips for the most part now, right? We used to build them all, now we import them all. And you read the story not too long ago. Some of those chips ended up in the Navy system, potentially, came very close. So we're worried about all those things as well. This is our supply chain control. It's in the SA family, again, SA12. And again, I'm not going to go into the detail. You can read about it in the catalog. And here are some of the areas in supply chain now that we have our control enhancements. These are sub-requirements under that SA12 control. But you can see we're worried about a lot of things in this whole space, to include all-source intelligence and operations security. Some of the things that were never on your radar before are going to have to be on your radar in the future. And there's 3 publications that I'm going to put up at the end of the presentation that will kind of focus you for the next year or so on what you need to pay attention to with regard to cybersecurity that really are going to make a difference between your organization being successful in the mission space or not. Here's a few more areas under the supply chain that are in the catalog. And I want to stress, the reason why cyber gets so difficult is because we have these large enterprises. And one of the things I was talking to Anil about in the hall a little bit ago is we're going to have to make some hard decisions. We're going to have to go through our enterprise, and we're going to have to say, hey, here's all of our data that we own, and we can categorize it under the NIST FIPS 199 as either low, moderate, or high impact data. That translates to stuff I really, really care about, and other stuff I care not very much about, and then there's the stuff in the middle that I kind of care about but not really care about. We've got to go through there and make sure we've got all that categorized, and then I think you have to take some bold action. I think you have to say, take half of your data and your applications within the next year or 18 months and move them to the public cloud, period. Hard stop. And the reason why I think that's necessary is you got to clean out the herd here. You got to thin the herd out a little bit so you can then understand whatever's left in your organization, whether it's the moderate or certainly the high impact data, the stuff that's critical for mission operations. Then you've got to be able to re-engineer what you have left using some of these techniques, using enterprise architecture, using good engineering techniques, strengthening what's left behind, even taking stuff and air gapping if you have to. In that Defense Science Board report I talked about with the different levels of vulnerabilities, there was one thing that really sent a chill up my spine, and that was when they made a recommendation for the military to take 20 of their fighter bombers and take them completely off the grid, not having any electronic connectivity. And the reason they said this was necessary is they said in the event of a massive cyber attack where it took down most of our military command and control, you would still have these 20 aircraft that you could deploy to a target that you had to deploy. That kind of statement is sobering. And these are people who understand the problem, not just folks who are looking at the latest patches coming out from Microsoft. We're talking about survivability of the nation. That's a sobering conversation that a lot of us don't have in our frenzy for thinking about when the next iPad's coming out. I love this technology, folks, just like you do, but we have to be able to have a serious conversation about this because we are running at very, very high risk today. And you're not going to see a cyber Pearl Harbor like they keep talking about. We've already had that. The cyber Pearl Harbor in our world is these adversaries who've already infiltrated our systems and have the malware ready to go, on standby, at their direction, at their launch command. That's what's really driving us today. So we have a brand new pub coming out. I got about 5 or 6 more minutes here. Look for this one coming out later in the summer, Security Engineering Guideline. This is giving you guidance on how to put together commercial products using good engineering techniques. And I equate it to building a bridge. It's not about painting the bridge and making it look pretty. There are some physics principles that went into constructing that bridge, forces, and all the things you have to do in physics problems to make sure that those stresses and those trusses are strong enough to support the structure. This is what we're going to do in the engineering guideline. We're going to bridge that gap between system engineering and security engineering, making sure they can speak the same language so we can start getting some of this into our acquisition process. These are the 3 pubs I said we would talk about here. We talked about Rev 4, all the controls. The engineering guideline is 800-160. And then the last one I want to call your attention to is a special pub on supply chain risk. That's coming out later in the summer as well. This is the 3-legged stool that our enterprises are either going to stand on or fall on. And any one of these legs of this 3-legged stool, if you take that leg out, that stool is going to kind of topple over. They're all 3 important for different reasons. I want to leave you with a final thought. I talked about good hygiene. That's getting up in the morning, brushing your teeth and shaving and doing all that stuff that you have to do to get going on the day. But the other part, this is the heavy lift. I think I mentioned this last time I was here. This last year I had to lose a little bit of weight. I lost about 60 pounds. And that's heavy lifting. If you ever been on a diet and you're exercising, they're things that don't come easy. Just like cybersecurity doesn't come easy. But yet, in my case, I had to lose the weight for health issues, so I had to do it. It was a heavy lift, but you do what you have to do to get the job done. And so when we talk about cyber hygiene, I want you to go full speed ahead on that. But I want you to also look at the infrastructure part of the problem. And when you think about that, think of things of like architecture, engineering, and system resiliency. That's, if there's one word that you take away from this conversation today, is the word resiliency. Last hour we talked about sandboxing and things like that. You have to be able to have your systems and your networks architected so they can withstand a cyber attack and not go down taking the entire enterprise with them. I use the analogy of the oil tanker. You know, in the old days, if you got hit in the bow of the oil tanker, you spilled the whole load. And then they got smart. They did these compartments. Now when you get hit in one compartment, you dump that compartment, but then the rest of the load is still intact. We know how to build networks that are more resilient. Is it more expensive to do? Probably. Is it necessary? Absolutely. It's all about achieving that appropriate balance. And you're going to hear there's going to be a lot of pressure. If you're in the federal government now, you're going to find a lot of pressure to do continuous monitoring. And my basic feeling on continuous monitoring is it's a good approach to gaining situational awareness on what you built. But it does not substitute for building a stronger IT infrastructure to begin with. So if we do nothing else and we start to monitor what we've got now, we're going to be wasting a lot of money. And that's not a politically correct thing to say, but I'm getting old enough now where I really don't care. I used to say what you say, right? Every dollar that you invest in continuous monitoring, you should be spending at least double that, $2, on building a stronger infrastructure, as a minimum, maybe 3. So look at your organizations, look at the OMB, look at all the money that we're going to be spending on continuous monitoring, and ask yourself, is that making me fundamentally stronger? That's an important question that we all have to address at some point. So let me leave you with one final thought. And this goes back to the Constitution that we started the discussion with today. If adversaries own your information system, and when I say own, that means not just a piece of malware that strays into your system. I'm talking about a rootkit or something they establish where they actually control everything about your system. If they do that, they will then own your intellectual property. And you can translate that if you're on the government side and the war fighters, they will own your national secrets as well if they get in and they own your system. And after that, they're going to own your identity. And anybody who's ever been a victim of identity theft, you know how that makes you feel. It's probably the worst feeling in the world because somebody else now is you. And that's not a very good feeling. And at that point, they're going to own you. And so I think when you put all these together, the thing that it tells me is, at this point, you, and possibly all of us, have lost our freedom. And that's why I start with the Constitution. It's all part of a great transformation. We're moving from a paper-based world where we knew how to defend ourselves to a full cyber world where we don't really have a clue how to defend ourselves to the degree that's necessary. I mean, we have people talking about it a lot, but the talk is not squaring with reality. And how long we can go down this road, like I say, we're at a fork in the road right now. Which direction we choose is going to really tell the future of the country, whether we're going to eventually erode our economic status to the point where we become, just another country down the food chain, or whether we're going to be leaders, putting a man on the moon, developing the first computer system, all the things that come from a free society that we've just taken for granted for so many years. That's why it drives me every morning when I get up, because this is stuff that really makes a difference. So with that, I always leave you with this is one of my favorite signs. This sign actually exists, by the way. You're going to hear this a lot. Sky was falling yesterday, it's going to be falling today, it's going to be falling tomorrow. We got to be able to control what you can control. This is Larry the Cable Guy, a simple guy. The stuff we have to do is really not that complicated. We just have to get it done. And with that, there's my contact information. I'll be around till tomorrow afternoon. I hope to talk to you individually. And again, I thank you for sharing your time on a Sunday. If we can be of any help to you at all, when you're building your programs or strengthening your programs, just call us. We're there literally 24/7. I'll give you my cell phone. You can call anytime. And I'm going to stop there. Thanks, guys.